My name is Reed Wilson Laney. I go by Wilson. Anything else you need to know? So I just literally retired on March 30th from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And what I did for the service was I was a senior biologist for fisheries and ecological services. And my work for the last 28 years has pretty much been working with diadromous species, which are species of fish that use saltwater and freshwater for their life cycle. So the anadromous ones spend most of their time in the ocean, migrate up rivers to spawn, and then go back out into the ocean. The catadromous ones, the only one we have is the American eel, does the reverse. So it spawns in the middle of the Sargasso Sea, and its eggs and larvae hatch, drift with currents. They enter East Coast estuaries in a glass eel stage. They turn into an elver stage, they turn into a yellow eel stage, they turn into a silver eel stage, which is when they're sexually mature, and then they migrate back to the middle of the Sargasso Ocean to spawn. So those are the species that have been the primary focus of my work. And I've done two primary things. I serve on a lot of different technical committees for the institutions that manage those species and their habitats. So the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is the body that manages all the diadromous species. They're based in Arlington, Virginia, and have been in existence since 1942, chartered by Congress. And more recently, 1993, they were given a whole lot of congressional authority to fine states out of compliance if they didn't adhere to the provisions of the fishery management plans for those species. So I serve on their striped bass technical committee, American eel technical committee, shad river herring technical committee, and a bunch of other stuff. I've also been the Fish and Wildlife Service's Southeast Region representative to the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, which is the federal fishery management council that manages everything from 300 to 200 miles offshore. So they meet 4 times a year. The commission meets 4 times a year. So a lot of the time I spend, sitting in meetings in conference rooms, taking notes, contributing to the conversation, or reviewing technical documents, or helping to co-author technical documents. I serve on a lot of plan review teams. So every fishery management plan has a team that reviews its performance annually. So we are responsible for writing up the plan and saying whether or not each state was in compliance with the plan. The other big thing I've done, and the more fun thing that I've done, is to spend time offshore on a research vessel tagging Atlantic sturgeon and striped bass. So that's part of the management plan for striped bass, is to tag a whole bunch of them every year, and that way as we get recaptures, we can track how many of them die as a result of fishing mortality, and also what the total mortality is for the stock. So that is something I got to do from 1992 to the present. Now we used to do it with a federal research trawler, a research vessel, use a big net, catch everything, just tag what we were interested in. In more recent years, we started documenting everything we were catching, which is the way it should have been done from the beginning. And then we switched over because we lost our funding for the research vessel time, which is very expensive, because we could tag a lot of fish using hook and line gear, and that way we only tag striped bass because that's all we catch. So we've been doing that since 2011, I think. And this year was not a good year for us. We only caught 90 fish and tagged 89, whereas last year, which was the previous low year, we caught 667 of them. So basically it boils down to, provision of technical assistance for different groups that are responsible for managing those fishes, and then doing field research on them to a certain extent. Now, since I retired, I will become, I already am, an adjunct assistant professor here at NC State in the Department of Applied Ecology. So that role will continue. And I will continue to do some of the things that I've been doing in that new role. I'll just have a different affiliation than I used to have. A fishery consists of the fish, obviously, but also the people that fish for the fish. So basically it's fish plus people plus gear if there's a commercial fishery, plus some sort of fishery management plan most of the time, and some sort of institution that's responsible for managing that fishery. So here in North Carolina, we have a bunch of them. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. There's a blue crab fishery. There's a shrimp fishery. Some of them are managed strictly by the states. So, for example, in North Carolina, striped mullet is a species that's totally under state jurisdiction. Sheep's head is another species that's totally under state jurisdiction. So the state is responsible for developing a fishery management plan. The interstate species, the diadromous ones that I was describing to you earlier, are those that migrate a long distance. And so a single state just can't manage those fish all by itself. There has to be cooperative and collaborative management. So in every case, pretty much, you have the plan that somebody's administering, you have the people that are fishing for it, you have different sectors to which part of the catch is allocated. So allocation just means who gets what, who gets how much. So if it's a commercial, usually there's at least two allocations. There'll be a commercial allocation and a recreational allocation. In the commercial side of things, though, there are often different gear types, and each gear type and each group of people using that gear type will have a certain portion of the catch allocated to them. So, for example, for striped bass offshore, we have a haul seine fishery that operates from the beach. We have a gill net fishery that uses gill nets offshore. We have a trawl fishery that uses trawls offshore to catch these fish. As an aside, the problem with striped bass is their distribution has shifted north and way offshore, so we don't have striped bass in North Carolina's ocean waters anymore. So North Carolina has not landed a striped bass under their ocean allocation since 2011. So climate change is causing species to shift offshore and north in some cases, and it's creating a real challenge for the management institutions because they have to figure out how to deal with allocation now. Let's see, what else about a fishery? So one other big important aspect of a fishery is law enforcement. Obviously, if you put a plan out there with a bunch of rules that everybody has to abide by, and no one chooses to abide by them, then you're not doing any good. So law enforcement is a very important component of a fishery as well, and it can be federal or state or both law enforcement. So the U.S. Coast Guard is responsible for enforcing a lot of the fishery laws, as is the National Marine Fisheries Service, as is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as are the state agencies. And a lot of times there's a thing called a Joint Enforcement Agreement, or JEA, that a state has to put into effect. And if they do that, then their state law enforcement officers have jurisdiction in federal waters then. And they get money from the federal government to help them implement the provisions of that act. North Carolina, unfortunately, is the only state on the East Coast, I think, or the Gulf of Mexico, that does not presently have a JEA in place for various reasons that I won't go into. Commercial fishing is basically an industry where people spend either all of their time or a good bit of their time fishing for a living. So it's their work, it's their job, and they use commercial gear to do that. So typically, again, you or I as a private citizen would not be able to go out and use a trawl, although in North Carolina it's one of the few states where they have what's called a coastal, commercial recreational fishing license. So we could be authorized to use commercial gear under certain circumstances, but usually for a whole lot less time or a whole lot less of that gear than a commercial fisherman would be allowed to use. Now, people have argued literally for decades over, what's the definition of a commercial fisherman? Some people who are very, want to define it very narrowly, would say you're only a commercial fisherman if you're in it full time. That's all you do. That's how you make all your income. Other people would say, well, no, that's not correct because, I make 50 or 60% of my income commercially fishing, so I'm really a commercial fisherman also. So the debate still goes on about what constitutes a commercial fisherman, but basically it's somebody who's in it for the money, making business off of it. And then one other, making a business out of it. And the other thing I need to mention to you is there's some crossover in that, you know, a recreational angler is somebody who's in it for fun or to catch food for themselves and is licensed by the state of North Carolina in this case, and just goes out, you know, does it for fun pretty much. There's a group of charter boats, though, that are kind of in the middle. So their captains take people out to fish recreationally as a business. So there's both a commercial and a recreational aspect to that particular sector. And sometimes it's difficult to figure out, you know, where to put them. If you're trying to manage a fishery and do what we call a stock assessment, which looks at the population of that particular fish to make sure it's healthy and sustainable, you have to count dead bodies, if you will, for every sector that's out there harvesting that fish. So the recreational sector is pretty clear, and there's a program called the Marine Recreational Information Program that's run by the states and the National Marine Fisheries Service that collects statistics on recreational landings every year. There's another program that is run by the National Marine Fisheries Service that collects commercial statistics every year. And so sometimes it's hard to figure out, well, where do we put the charter boat guys? You know, do they go with the rec side or do they go with the commercial side? The pro of commercial gear, I think, is that it is highly selective and very efficient. So if you want to catch spotted sea trout, let's say, of a legal size, which is 14 inches now, I think, then you can use a mesh size of net that captures only that size fish or slightly larger fish maybe. It's extremely efficient gear type. The downside, and same thing goes for trawls, you know, you can design a trawl that has a mesh size that's appropriate for whatever you want to catch. The downside is you catch a lot of other stuff in a trawl. Trawls have a bigger, we call it bycatch issue than gill nets do, although gill nets have it as well. So that downside is part of the reason you have this big argument going on right now in North Carolina, kind of between the commercial sector and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation to try and change inshore trawling. And North Carolina is one of the few states that still allows the use of trawls inshore in our estuarine waters. Most other states have banned it. They don't do it anymore. And North Carolina doesn't allow it everywhere. You can't trawl in Albemarle Sound, for example. It's closed. You can't trawl in primary nursery areas. Those are closed to trawling. Another downside of commercial gear, and I'll talk about recreational gear in a second too, because they're not totally exempt from adverse impact. Another downside of commercial gear is entanglement of imperiled or threatened and endangered species. So you have this bycatch that's going on. For example, in the striped bass gillnet fishery in Albemarle Sound, that fishery also catches juvenile and subadult Atlantic sturgeon, which is a federally listed endangered species. So if you're not running your nets on a very short time interval, those fish will die. You know, if they stay overnight for 2 or 3 days, especially if the water temperature is very warm, that increases the mortality. So you have to deal with that somehow. And the way the National Marine Fisheries Service has dealt with it, once a species is listed, is they say, well, you have to have a Section 10 incidental permit under the Endangered Species Act. And if you get that, it's going to have a limit on it. So let's just say for Albemarle Sound, which is a Atlantic sturgeon nursery area, they may say, here's your incidental take limit. It's 100 fish. Once you kill that many, you're done. You got to shut your fishery down. Same thing is in place for sea turtles, because North Carolina's estuaries are big nursery areas for sea turtles, and they're also listed. And then offshore, we have northern right whales, which is one of the most endangered species in the whole world. You know, very, very few of them there. And so we worry about entanglement in pot fisheries offshore.
I just want to say hi. Sorry,
Hey.
sitting there.
How you doing?
Doing well.
Talk to you later.
Is that it?
Yeah, I think so. Well, let me say, I was going to say about recreational. So the recreational guys, a lot of times will say, oh, we're exempt from these concerns because we don't have any adverse impact. Well, that's not true. They also have a bycatch. If you put a baited hook out there with an attractive bait on it, you're going to catch something else besides what you're fishing for, probably. So they're not totally exempt either. And they have, if there's a legal size limit in place, say 14 inches again for spotted sea trout, and you're out there fishing all day long and all you're catching is 12-inch spotted sea trout, then we call that a regulatory bycatch, and all those fish have to go back in the water. Well, not all of them make it. Some of them are going to die. If you hook one in the gills and the gills it's bleeding and all that kind of stuff, then you do have an impact. And there are rare occasions, admittedly far fewer occasions, where recreational fishermen hook up with loggerhead sea turtles and things like that. And they may snag a sturgeon, but usually they can release them without harm. I think that as long as the fishery is regulated in a sustainable manner, then the fishery is usually able to sustain both commercial and recreational fishing. It just has to be managed appropriately. So what you do is you put measures in place to reduce the adverse impacts that you know are occurring. So one of the things that the Wildlife Federation, for example, has suggested is that in North Carolina, inshore waters, it would be appropriate to reduce the size of the trawls down, make them smaller, and also preclude vessels from towing 4 trawls at a time and from lining up. Sometimes you may have seen these aerial photos of 6 or 7 trawlers towing abreast of each other so that they're, not just sweeping a path by the 4 trawls being towed by one vessel. They're sweeping, much wider path because you've got 6 or 7 trawlers lined up together, towing across. So basically the answer is you put measures in place to reduce the adverse and undesirable impacts of commercial gear. For gill nets, that means you reduce the number of hours they can be fished. So you tell fishermen you have to tend your nets. If you know you're in an area that has lots of sea turtles and lots of Atlantic sturgeon, then you put a net tending measure into effect, and you say you can set your nets, you can fish them for this long, but you have to be out there with them so you can remove any endangered species that you catch as soon as you catch it and increase the probability of it surviving. Yeah, but there are many variables that we cannot control. One of them is climate change. Another one is the weather. Another one is recruitment failure. So what that means is that in order for a fishery to remain sustainable and healthy, there have to be enough babies produced every year by what we call the spawning stock biomass, which is the number of mature males and females out there. There has to be enough babies that are produced and then survive to reach adulthood to keep the numbers of that population up. So yeah, we worry about that a lot, and we spend a lot of money collecting data every year for every managed fishery. And there are 2 types basically that we collect. Fishery dependent data, which I referred to earlier, that MRIP program, and the Commercial Fishing Statistics Program, which looks at all of the poundage of fish of each species that gets landed. Dealers in North Carolina have to have a license. They're required to report. Commercial fishermen in North Carolina have to have a license. They're required to report. So there's mandatory reporting in place. They have to let the agency who's responsible for managing those fisheries, in this case it's the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries and the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission that work together to manage those fisheries. They have to let them know how many fish they caught, how many pounds or numbers of fish. And then the other type of data we collect is fishery independent data. So the way that works is we have a survey program that's designed, that's independent of any of the commercial or recreational fisheries, that goes out there and collects data. And the idea here is that you get a more unbiased picture of what's actually going on with the population. So, for example, the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries has what they call their primary nursery area program, which I think is program 195 or something like that, where they go out there with a small trawl and they sample in all the nursery areas that have been designated for that purpose in North Carolina. So you generate numbers. Usually those programs are designed in one of several different ways. You can establish permanent stations that are sampled on some sort of a basis, often a monthly basis, for year after year after year. Or you can do a stratified random sampling program where you may look at something. For example, this is the way the Northeast Area Monitoring and Assessment Program works off the north of Cape Hatteras all the way up to Maine. There, they've divided the offshore bottom into depth strata, different levels of depth. And so they just randomly pick stations within those depth stratums, and they go out there and they sample again with a trawl, and they quantify everything they catch. So hopefully, between the number of animals that are landed that you get from your fishery dependent data sets and the data that you get from your fishery independent data sets, you get a pretty good picture of what's happening with the population from year to year. What throws you curves, though, is, there's several sources of bias, I guess I should say. One is there's always a gear bias of some sort. I talked earlier about how gill nets are extremely selective, and they are. But obviously, if you're selecting for a given species, if you're using a 5.5-inch mesh versus a 10-inch mesh, you're going to get two entirely different sets of numbers and different sizes of fish. So there's a gear selectivity or gear bias that's built into it. And then the other thing that you can't really control for is whether or not your gear is catching all age classes of a given population. So, for example, we use hook and line offshore for striped bass because we want to catch big striped bass that have already entered the migratory segment of the population. Well, we're not going to catch, young of year striped bass. We have to get those data from other fishery independent sampling programs that are operating inside Pamlico Sound or inside Chesapeake Bay that are using totally different gear types. So they would be using either a trawl with a much smaller mesh size or beach seines with a much smaller mesh size.
Okay.
So if you put all that together, and that's what these assessments tend to do, then you should get a pretty comprehensive picture of what's going on. And sometimes, though, you get thrown a curve if you have very poor recruitment. So if your juvenile sampling shows, whoops, we didn't get any striped bass, which may happen this year because the water level in the Roanoke River's been so high for so long because of all the rainfall we've had, then you can tell ahead of time if you do what's called a forward projection model. You take all the data that you have from all the years you've been sampling, and then you plug in some assumptions about what recruitment is going to do in the future, and you can project what you think the population is going to do out over the next 3 or 4 years. Obviously, the shorter the time interval, the more likely you are to get, decent results. But sometimes you get fooled because you have to make assumptions. You don't know what the recruitment's going to be. You can plug in an average recruitment, or if you think it's going to be really good, you can plug in a high recruitment. Or if you think it's going to be really, really sorry, then you plug in a low recruitment. And sometimes the stock assessment scientists, who are the number crunching biologists, who are the ones that do these assessments, will do what they call run sensitivity analyses on their model. Once they built the model and they feel like the model it's all math, it's fitting the data very well. In other words, you look at the 20 or 30 year or even longer time series of data that you have, and your model can fit it very closely or sometimes not so closely. If it fits it very well, then you have a higher level of confidence in your results in terms of projecting things forward.